So I was asked to talk about the nuclear dimensions of Russian invasion of Ukraine. We know that this is a conventional war. That is to say that it has been so far, and hopefully will remain, hopefully it's over soon, but we hope it stays conventional, right? We hope this war does not see the use of nuclear weapons. This does not mean, though, that it's just a conventional war. This war is very much a nuclear crisis, and I'm going to try and explain in what ways and what kinds of consequences do I see as an analyst, what kind of consequences this war has for the so-called global nuclear order. And I will also explain exactly what I mean by a global nuclear order. It's kind of a wide and nebulous term. I will talk about certain subsystems, certain systems within this kind of broader global nuclear order. The way I see it, it consists of at least three components. One is the so-called system of nuclear deterrence. The other one is a system of restraint, and it's not so easy to translate into Ukrainian. I have it here as обмеження або стриманості, right? So it's the original term that a scholar actually used was abstinence. It's a little awkward. It's a bit of an awkward term, but it has everything to do with states not acquiring nuclear weapons, right? Saying no to nuclear weapons. And finally, I maintain that the war in Ukraine has consequences for the global governance of civilian nuclear energy. What is the system of nuclear deterrence? Deterrence is a very paradoxical concept. In fact, Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of British Prime Minister, called it a melancholy paradox. It is indeed counterintuitive because it is based on a threat of doing exactly what you're trying to avoid from happening, right? So in the, excuse me, in the nuclear dimension, deterrence is based on a threat of damage, right? A threat of retaliation to your adversary, to convince him that the cost of attacking you first, attacking you with nuclear weapons first, outweighs any of the benefits of such an attack, right? The whole peculiarity of nuclear weapons in the world that was realized very early on in the nuclear age, basically, you know, in 1947, 1945 is when nuclear weapons enter this world. But in 1947, some of the earliest theorists of nuclear deterrence theorized that up to this age, weapons have been used to conduct and win wars. From this point on, at least nuclear weapons are used to avoid wars. And that's the basic principle of nuclear deterrence, right? All they're good for in the deterrence theory, all nuclear weapons are good for, is for threatening retaliation in case your nuclear armed adversary thinks of launching them first. So the whole idea is not to use nuclear weapons, right? A political theorist, a very profound thinker, Michael Walzer, in his seminal book on the ethics of wars, ethics of violence, just and unjust wars, you see it here, written in 1977, described this paradox as follows: we threaten evil in order not to do it, for the doing of it is so terrible that the threat of it almost seems justified in comparison, right? So it is, he qualified the statement later on after the end of the Cold War, but this is just to give you an idea of kind of the basic concept of nuclear deterrence. What we have to keep in mind, however, when we talk about nuclear weapons, is that historically, right, deterrence is a theory, it's a system of practice, it is built into doctrines of nuclear states, but throughout history of existence of nuclear weapons, deterrence was not the only way in which nuclear states used their nuclear arsenals. They also used nuclear threats for coercion. So not just to dissuade an adversary not to launch these nuclear weapons first, but to also threaten possible nuclear use in order to coerce, in order to force a state to do something that a nuclear state wants. There have also been plans to use nuclear weapons on the battlefield, right? Both NATO and the Soviet Union, and possibly today Russia, we don't quite understand fully their operational plans regarding nuclear weapons. They have planned to use smaller, so-called tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, just like conventional weapons, only bigger, right? And that can bust through fortified positions of the adversary and so forth. In the recent years, perhaps in the recent decades, the coercive and the battlefield use, thinking, planning for such use of nuclear weapons has been largely delegitimized, right? There's a growing awareness that really, as long as these weapons exist in the world, the deterrence really is the only way that could be possibly justified of using nuclear weapons. We see that changing now in the war in Ukraine. I'm sure all of you can think of very quickly of examples of how Russia has been using its nuclear threats and its nuclear arsenal, but we'll return to that in a little bit. Okay, now next slide. Oops. So with that, of course, I want to give you a quick rundown of the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the world, right? United States were the first country to develop them in 1945. They tested them in the famous Trinity test and then used them. The first and only time nuclear weapons have been used in war in the very well-known explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Shortly thereafter, in 1941, the USSR conducted its first nuclear test in Kazakhstan on the Semipalatinsk test range. Then the UK followed, France acquired nuclear weapons by 1960. And then due to the confluence of circumstances, one was a nuclear test by China, which was at that time considered to be a technologically backward, poor country. It is today that we think of China as a rising power, as, kind of, a great big economy. In 1960s, China was very far from that. And the fact that this technology could be mastered by a country that is not technologically advanced, right? So before that, we had the USSR was, of course, broken and devastated by World War II, and its quick acquisition or quick development of nuclear weapons in 1949 caught the United States and the West by surprise. But then, of course, the UK was no big surprise at all. It was actually part of the Manhattan Project in the United States contributed scientists and expertise to the Manhattan Project, the American project on developing nuclear bomb. In France, a developed, technologically developed country. But when China tested nuclear weapons, there was suddenly a realization that this is not, the technology of the rich and of the developed countries. And if China could muster this technology, then who else can? And how quickly can these weapons spread around the world? At the same time, in 1962, in October 1962, exactly 60 years ago, the world came very close to a nuclear conflagration, possibly a nuclear war, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the so-called Caribbean crisis. And a confluence of these events and some other things led to the realization that there needs to be a way to restrain. There needs to be a way to control the spread of these weapons around the world. The world with more states, nuclear states in it, is not a safer world. And so countries got together, led by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, that became the three so-called depository states, sort of the guardians, right, of this treaty, and signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 1968. It is by today, it is one of the most successful and long-lasting treaties there are in the international system. Certainly the most long-lasting and successful arms control treaty in the world. Today, there's 191 party states in this treaty, right? But as much as it has been a success, as much as it is credited with kind of slowing, as it were, or thwarting the spread of nuclear weapons around the world, there has still been a number of states that acquired nuclear weapons even after the signature and coming into force of the NPT. The first one to break ranks, and of course, it was never party to the NPT in the first place, was India. It tested a nuclear device. It said it was for peaceful purposes, and yet this is where the Indian nuclear program started. The so-called Smiling Buddha explosion in 1974. In 1970s, South Africa launched a nuclear program that was successful too. They built 6 nuclear weapons. At that time, we found out that through 60s and early 70s, Israel had also developed nuclear weapons. There has been, so by that time, we had 5 states that were part of kind of original 5, right, before the NPT. And then India came along, and then South Africa and Israel, that's already 8, right, 8 nuclear states. Due to the end of the apartheid regime and other changes, South Africa unilaterally and freely decided to relinquish and dismantle its nuclear arsenal. That happened in 1991, and it joined the NPT as a non-nuclear state. Later on, in that same year, the Soviet Union falls apart. So one of the original nuclear states, one of the founders of the NPT, disintegrates into constitutive republics, right? And 4 of those inherit parts of its vast nuclear arsenal. And those 4 are Russia, of course, but also Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. And the question becomes, well, how do you handle this proliferation through state death, through state collapse and succession, right? How do you handle succession questions? And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about Ukraine, but this has been the focus of my research. By 1994, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine joined the NPT and transfer all of nuclear warheads on their territory to Russia. So here we see sort of a wave of proliferations and then a wave of rollbacks, of de-proliferation, as it were, through the early 90s. So this is a very good time, as it were, for the non-proliferation regime. And also, if you note, while it is very laudable what Ukraine, but also Belarus and Kazakhstan did, we cannot, if we're informed citizens, say that Ukraine is the only country that ever gave up its nuclear arsenal, right? That would be incorrect. South Africa did that first, right? And Belarus and Kazakhstan did that along with Ukraine. So once we celebrated as an international community this big wave of de-proliferation, of the scaling down of nuclear weapons in the world, India and Pakistan come out and declare themselves nuclear states. I'm sorry, I have the sun here in my face. They declare themselves as nuclear states. They conduct usually, becoming a nuclear state means you have a nuclear test, right? And because India started a nuclear program, Pakistan, that traditionally viewed India as its, adversary, enemy, and a threat. They fought a very, very bloody war of partition back in the 40s. Pakistan develops a nuclear weapon as well. And the latest country to join this club, as it were, of nuclear possessors is North Korea, as you probably well know and heard. So today we have 9 nuclear states in the world. 5 of them are the original 5. They're accommodated within the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and the 4, they stayed outside of that treaty. Well, in fact, North Korea was party to the NPT, and then in 2003, it left the treaty and developed nuclear weapons. Right. So here are all of the nuclear possessors and a total number of nuclear weapons throughout the history. As you can see, the overall number of nuclear weapons in the world peaked in the 80s, mostly due to the Soviet arsenal, right? Soviet Russian arsenal. Today, these arsenals have been largely dismantled. So you will hear the United States and Russia say that they have eliminated 80% of nuclear weapons that they had once possessed, of the peak. Still, these states possess together 90% of all nuclear weapons in the world today. So they by far outnumber any other nuclear possessor. So we see the numbers here. China is at roughly 350, although it is building up its nuclear arsenal very quickly, right? We just about a year ago discovered, or maybe in the spring, if memory serves, satellite imagery discovered that China is building silos, Schachte, for the in-ground stationary missiles. And there's about another 300 of those. So it might well double the number of nuclear weapons, but still nowhere close to what Russia and the United States possess. And so to sum it all up, and this is a very, very busy slide. Okay, I'm moving away from the sun here. But I'll try to talk through it. I tried to visualize here all the different components of this global nuclear order. And it's a system that, as I described it, it consists of these two systems, or you can conceptualize it that way. It's helpful, right? I'm not saying that this is the way it is, but it's helpful for me to imagine it this way, right? To kind of analytically kind of summarize it this way. There's a system of nuclear deterrence here, and there's a system of restraint, or as the original sort of theorist of kind of this way of looking at nuclear order, British political scientist William Walker, he called it a system of abstinence, right? So you abstain, you decide not to acquire nuclear weapons. So within the system of nuclear deterrence, that consists of certain practices, ideas, theory of deterrence, but also very real investments that states make into nuclear weapons, into their, the doctrines that they have, the weapons that they actually build and deployed, the plans to modernize those weapons over time. Both the United States and Russia today are investing money into actually developing new systems. And those systems will still serve for a very long time, right? Like new warheads and new launch vehicles, new delivery systems, as they call it, so missiles and airplanes and cruise missiles. Because if you just have a nuclear warhead and it's sitting on your territory, it's no good. It's only a target. What you need is a system to deliver it, right, with some precision. So all of those are underpinned by a military-industrial complex, companies, budgets that deliver these systems. There are many new technologies that are emerging that have impact on this, on these strategic weapons and these nuclear weapons. Cyber, we're concerned about how cyber attacks might affect or disable command and control of nuclear weapons, right? If it's an automated system. Space, a lot of your command and control, again, is linked through space. If your space assets, your satellites, military satellites are attacked, then it could disable your capacity to conduct, to credibly threaten a nuclear strike. There's, of course, these 4 nuclear states that remain outside of the non-proliferation regime. So they are not kind of constrained in any way by any arms control agreements, obligations vis-a-vis other states. And I'll return to the arms control bit a little bit later, but this is just to say that, both of these systems understand the need to manage and control nuclear arms, right? So it's not a free-for-all. It's not anyone could have anything, and if you have nuclear weapons, you can do whatever you want with them. Historically, states have seen value in having some kinds of arms control agreements for transparency reasons, just so they can sort of both they, traditionally it was the Soviet Union and the United States, they could kind of know what the other side has, and that way kind of coordinate things, right? Make things more transparent between them. But within this system, arms control is viewed purely for strategic stability, right? To make sure that no one side develops any kind of destabilizing armaments, right? It's not exactly arms control for the purposes of let's say, diminishing the number of weapons. Not necessarily. Often meant that, but not necessarily. On the other hand, we have this large and very elaborate system of nuclear restraint. So most countries in the world do not have nuclear weapons, right? There is NPT. A lot of countries, most countries in the world are non-nuclear member states of the NPT. There's a treaty on the prohibition of of nuclear testing, the CTBT, the complete test ban treaty. That's what it is. It is not in force, but it is actually working. It has stations that can detect a nuclear test anywhere in the world and can report to its headquarters in Vienna if a state conducts nuclear tests. So at least we would know that this is how we know about North Korean nuclear tests, for instance. There are other interstate and intergovernmental organizations that do exactly that, that try to limit, right, and control the spread of these technologies that would be necessary to develop nuclear weapons, or even means of their delivery. There's a regime of their missile technology control regime, and also nuclear suppliers group. So that's when states come together that have this capability and they agree on export controls, right? So the whole purpose here is to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. And of course, the United States and the European Union in particular have had their own state policies that are aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. Lastly, and most importantly, there's a new treaty that just came into force literally a year ago or so, and it's the so-called ban treaty, so a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that tries to delegitimize nuclear weapons altogether as inhumane and illegal weapons. So as you can see, there's a bit of a problem here. In fact, there are many problems with these two subsystems. They have a lot of tensions between them. It is ultimately unfair, and it is ultimately discriminatory that some states should have nuclear weapons and some states should not, right? And who is to say to the states who don't have nuclear weapons, no, you should never develop any? This was a major problem in trying to get the states to agree to this NPT treaty back in the 60s, right? The 5 nuclear states, the idea was, all right, the 5 that had developed nuclear weapons by that time get to have them, but everyone else has to relinquish them, or has to relinquish the right to develop them. Clearly, that did not seem like a fair deal to many of the countries that actually have the capability and perhaps even a motivation to develop nuclear weapons. Why should they, relinquish their sovereign right to develop this most formidable weapon if other states, such as the United States, USSR, France, Britain, and China, get to have them? So in order to make this more palatable, in order to ameliorate this discriminatory nature of the NPT, there were several kind of basically bargains that were made between nuclear states and non-nuclear states. And the basic, what I think, the basic kind of the crux of the bargain is that the nuclear states within NPT, the 5 that we talked about, promise to pursue in good faith negotiations towards the cessation of arms race and total and complete disarmament. So the 5 states have taken that commitment, have taken that on. So they're supposed to be negotiating towards complete disarmament. It's built into the international system, right? And this is this Article 6 here, Article 6 of the NPT. It's a very important article, and that's why I picture it as actually linking these two systems together, right? They're the reinforcing, kind of accommodating one to another. Another bargain is the development of civilian nuclear energy So of course, the states that have nuclear weapons, they also have technology for civilian purposes, right? Those nuclear technologies, because ultimately they're very similar. They're so-called dual purpose. And they pledge to share these technologies with all these other non-nuclear states to share and accommodate the development of civilian nuclear technology, because nuclear energy is used for many very important civilian purposes. One we all know is the generation of electricity, but another, it's used widely in medicine, in agriculture, medicine curing cancer. That's all radioactive isotopes. And you have to be able to conduct research and to develop this kind of capability domestically. So that's another kind of bargain that's built into this system. But as I said here, there are many, many tensions, right? And the chief of them, the chief tension there being that it's ultimately unfair, right? It's ultimately a discriminatory system. And it's very difficult to argue, right, that some states should have these weapons and others shouldn't. And this is ultimately the source or the reason for this ban treaty, this newest treaty that was adopted at the UN and that had come into force in 2021, I think in January 2021, that tries to ban these weapons altogether. Because the supporters of this treaty argue that the nuclear states have not really delivered very much on Article 6, on nuclear disarmament, and on Article 4 as well. All right. Fast forward to today. We have a war in Ukraine, a war completely unprovoked, illegal, and illegally fought. Unleashed by the Russian regime. And it has, from the beginning to today, transpired under this nuclear shadow. It's been conducted under the shadow of nuclear threats. Here's, as you probably know, the speech with which President Putin inaugurated this his invasion, threatening consequences never seen or never encountered in history. That's another way of saying we are willing to use nuclear weapons, right? There are many kind of sort of proxies or of ways to express nuclear threats in the nuclear world, and this is of course one of them. All available means is another one. So if states talk about we'll use all available means, they're saying we'll also are willing to use nuclear weapons or threaten their use. What war in Ukraine shows, right, these first nuclear threats were really directed not so much against Ukraine, they were directed against Western powers, against Ukraine's Western partners, NATO and the United States. And the message was, do not get involved directly, or you'll see the consequences never seen in history, right? And it seems that it's worked, all right? Even before the war, the United States made it very, very clear, and so did other NATO countries, that they will not put so-called boots on the ground in Ukraine. They made it clear that they will not get involved. Why? A very justified fear that if two nuclear adversaries start a direct kinetic conflict, even if it's conventional conflict, this conflict can escalate to a nuclear level. And if we think about it, even throughout the whole Cold War, there hasn't been many proxy wars, right? Where the opposing, the two superpowers supported opposing camps, but there has never been a direct military conflagration. Cuban Missile Crisis came very close. the flip side of the fact that deterrence actually worked to restrain Western participation, Western kind of involvement on the Ukrainian side, is that the war started in a space, in a country that was not protected by nuclear deterrence. Ukraine does not have its own nuclear weapons, nor is it protected by the so-called extended nuclear deterrence, like, for instance, Poland is. Poland is a member of NATO, and as such, it receives so-called extended nuclear deterrence from the United States. So basically, the United States says, if anyone, quote unquote, Russia, thinks of invading Poland, we're prepared to defend Poland with all available means, meaning including nuclear weapons. So this is a rather unfortunate example that nuclear weapons kind of work. They work to protect countries, and the countries that are not protected by nuclear weapons are at risk, right? I'm often asked, what would Russia have invaded had Ukraine kept its nuclear weapons? I like to put another counterfactual forward. Would Russia have invaded if Russia were not a nuclear state and could not count on deterring the West from getting involved in Ukraine? And counterfactuals are tricky. We don't know the answer to that, but it looks like Russia has been using nuclear weapons exactly as this to coerce and to shield its aggressive designs on Ukraine. In addition, there is a non-negligible risk of Russian nuclear use in Ukraine, right? Because the threats have escalated, not just to deter the West, but to also threaten nuclear use to protect so-called territorial integrity, as you see in the quote here. And that is well beyond what, say, Russian doctrine says about the use of nuclear weapons, or any conceivable justifiable use of nuclear weapons. Now, what does this war then mean for the system of restraint? Well, the optics are very, very bad, right? Specifically because of Ukraine's nuclear history. As you all well know, in 1994, Ukraine made a decision to surrender the nuclear weapons it had inherited from the USSR in exchange for, it was a whole deal, right? So it wasn't just the security assurances and just the Budapest Memorandum, there was a financial part of it. But the security assurances, which are translated as security guarantees in Ukrainian and Russian, have been a very important part at the time of this nuclear deal of convincing Ukrainian leadership to surrender nuclear weapons. Now, I have to say, stop here, and I know we're almost out of time because I have gone for too long, but I will just say a few things about this, the story of disarmament and this Budapest Memorandum, and I'll probably just stop with that and leave the rest of the time for questions. What Ukraine inherited at the time was a nuclear option. It did not inherit a ready-to-use deterrent, right? What Ukraine inherited was a part of a nuclear arsenal and a nuclear capability designed by a different country for different strategic purposes, for deterring NATO and for deterring the West, right, and the United States. To take that inheritance and to refashion it into something Ukraine could have used as a deterrent against Russia, which was very clearly the security threat to Ukraine then as it is now, would have taken a lot of investment and would have taken going against, right? So So we have to remember when we look at it, Ukraine was not just making these decisions in a vacuum. It was making these decisions with this being part of this whole international system. There being IAEA, there being NPT, there being nuclear suppliers group, all sorts of ways in which the countries tried to restrain the spread of nuclear weapons. So basically, the choice that Ukraine faced was not only finding the money to invest in, say, the full fuel cycle, enrichment, uranium enrichment, and plutonium reprocessing capacity, building, spending millions to build this up, but also defying, going against this whole non-proliferation consensus, this whole non-proliferation regime, becoming a pariah. It certainly would have. Now, this is not to say that, if Ukraine just persevered and stuck to its guns and, weathered that storm, it could have come out on the other side more secure and protected by its own deterrent that probably, if it did, probably would have deterred Russia from invading. It just to say that Ukraine would have been an entirely different country had it embarked on that journey. So again, I know it's a very painful question in Ukraine about the surrender of nuclear weapons. But what I'm telling you is that I personally think that at the time, given the choices, it was the right thing to do. What was not the right thing to do was to breach the Budapest Memorandum by Russia. And to be fairly honest, I think the response of the other signatories, the United States and Great Britain, was far from sufficient to that first instance of breach, right? They made very little out of the Budapest Memorandum and the security assurances they had pledged. And I think the voices in Ukraine at the time who said, dismiss the Budapest Memorandum as, being worthless, they also added to that inadvertently. So with that, I will end and leave some time for questions. But basically, my concluding thought for you is that nuclear weapons are part and parcel of this bigger system, bigger, very complex notions and systems and institutions in the world. And they are clearly not, they do certain things, but they're clearly not a panacea for all the security threats and all the security problems that are out there. And that, conventional arms and conventional deterrence is also a thing and also should not be neglected. Thank you so much. Now I'll stop sharing. I see Sergey, Igor.
Yeah. Igor, it is me, so thank you for your lecture. And I have a question that will the world use nuclear weapon far away from solar system? Because if we to think fantastically, our technology are developing because we can fly away from Earth to explore other planets and other creatures. For example, aliens. And we don't know who are they. Are they enemy? Are they friends? And I think that nuclear question will be undecided due or maybe thanks to or due to far future. Thank you.
Ігор, повторіть по-українськи, щоб я краще зрозуміла.
Ну добре. Я чого маю на увазі, чи будуть використовувати ядерну зброю в далекому майбутньому, обороняючи чи засвоюючи якісь інші планети, чи воюючи з ворожими расами інопланетян. Бо насправді ми в всесвіті не одні. І ми не знаємо, які створіння будуть оточувати нас, чи то друзі, чи то вороги.
So very good question. So there's this famous nuclear physicist that used to be actual part of the Manhattan Project, Niels Bohr, is Danish, and he used to say, predictions are always difficult, especially about the future. You're asking me about a very far out future, and you know, it's very, very difficult to anticipate and predict. But I suppose that if the Earthlings still have nuclear weapons in their arsenals at the time when we encounter different lives, I think the question of whether to use nuclear weapons will be certainly considered. There's a great sci-fi series, The Expanse, that plays with that, with nuclear use in outer space.
Дякую за відповідь.
Ще, може, хтось має запитання, то прошу піднімати руки.
Будь ласка, студентство, колеги.
А ось,
Хікматулла, будь ласка. Хікматулла, будь ласка, задавайте питання.
Я перепрошую. Я хотів би спочатку висловити подяку вам, як спікеру. Це було дуже гарно слухати. Моє питання звучить так. Чи є, на вашу думку, умови в найближчому майбутньому, щоб весь світ почав знищувати власну ядерну зброю та більше не вдаватися до цієї зброї? І що найважливіше, чи може бути таке, що на зміну цій зброї не прийде ще якась зброя більш масовіша та більш загрозливіша? Дякую.
These are very good questions. I'll start with the second one, whether there could be, you know, if we get rid of nuclear weapons, is there a guarantee that something much worse might not, you know, arise? There certainly isn't a guarantee, right? Humans have outdone themselves in their ingenuity of designing all sorts of weapons of mass destruction. But so far as we can see, there are only two existential threats to humankind, meaning threats that are capable of obliterating, of changing the life on Earth as we know it. One is climate change, and the other one is nuclear weapons. If all of the arsenals in this world are used for what they are designed, they're designed to fly and explode, right, and destroy things. If these arsenals are used, life on Earth as we know it, certainly our civilization, will be destroyed. So it's difficult to imagine, you know, a weapon as destructive. But we have seen what, say, biological pathogens are capable of. We've all lived through a pandemic, and that was, you know, a pandemic. They're biological weapons in biological labs, and Russia actually has, or had back in the day, the Soviet Union had a very large biological weapons program. It has pledged to dismantle it, but of course we're pretty sure that they have not dismantled it completely. I find that actually the war in Ukraine makes the conditions for total and complete disarmament very unfavorable for the reasons that I explained. It unfortunately, you know, I have always kind of advocated and supported the idea of non-proliferation, of the less nuclear weapons, the better, right, in the world. Not least because they're man-made tools, they're man-made implements. And nothing that is man-made is you know, guaranteed, right? It's not perfect. We've seen what happened to Chernobyl, right? There could be accidents, even if you don't mean to use them. Something could go wrong, right? And you cannot afford that with a nuclear weapon. And so my job as someone who's always advocated for disarmament or non-proliferation has actually gotten really hard, much, much harder, because I imagine countries looking at Ukraine and saying, this is what happens when you disarm. This is what happens when you don't have nuclear weapons. That kind of, you know, cruel war can happen to you by a nuclear armed adversary, and nobody will, you know, yes, you will receive armaments, you will receive all sorts of support, but people won't come to your you know, certainly other nuclear armed countries won't come in to help. You know, Ukraine, I think certainly if the war ends in the way that Ukraine prevails, even despite all these nuclear threats, even despite you know, Russia's best efforts, then the value of nuclear weapons will be seen as, you know, that they're useless. Though it is still difficult to imagine, you know, the thousands of people who are gone, they'll never come back. And countries who are looking at their own security, they will be thinking, how do I not only fight and win a war, how do I prevent it from happening in the first place? And unfortunately, it seems to me, and I hate to say it, but it seems that many of the countries might make a conclusion that nuclear weapons might be the answer. Я бачу в чаті є питання від Максима Бохана, чи є доцільно Україні повернути ядерну зброю як фактор стримування Росії? So for Ukraine today, to launch a nuclear weapons program would be very costly and very difficult to do, right, under the circumstances. So it would also be unable to do it without the support of some kind of partner internationally, not least because, you know, when I say a support, at least the commitment not to impede, not to try and stop Ukraine. So we see there's one country today that has nuclear ambitions, and that's Iran. And we see all the different ways in which the United States and Europe and everyone else are trying to stop them. Sanctions are one thing, so complete isolation. So it seems that, you know, Ukraine is in this really strange position where it's a partner to the West, right? It does not want to defy the West and Western countries such as, you know, NATO, the NATO alliance and the United States. It relies on the support, on the military support of these countries. And so it can't really, you know, run afoul. And again, it's not just their kind of, you know, their little whim, something they want. There's a whole system of nuclear restraint that they're trying to enforce. So I think it would be, even if the political decision in Ukraine is taken that maybe there's a potential or idea to you know, renew or start a nuclear program, I think it would be very difficult for Ukraine to do that without losing the support of the West.
Пані доктор, ми дуже дякуємо за цю дуже актуальну, насправді, дуже важливу тему, яку ви підняли. Ми радо вітаємо вас тут серед нашої української спільноти. Маємо надію, що ми ще раз вас побачимо чи почуємо. Дякуємо дуже пану Сергію за організацію, за переклад. Час, на жаль, дійшов до кінця, ми його не будемо перебирати. До зустрічі, до контакту.
Дуже дякую вам. І якщо у когось залишились питання, на які я не встигла відповісти, прошу мені написати у Сергія, є мій емейл, або прошу знайти мене десь на Твіттері, Мбуджерен, ініціали і прізвище. І просто напишіть, буду рада поспілкуватися. І всім бажаю триматися і йти впевнено до перемоги.
Дякуємо. Прагнемо до перемоги. Так. До зв'язку.